Would you stand up for a veteran being wronged? Here's how one young man turned a terminal into a movement. The crowded terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport hummed with the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and murmured conversations. Among the travelers, a Marine veteran named Thomas stood near gate C-23 with his German Shepherd Max by his side. The pair were hard to miss. Thomas, in his mid-40s, wore a weathered leather jacket and a cap embroidered with the words, Semper Fi. Max, sporting a service dog vest, sat attentively, his deep brown eyes scanning the crowd as if always on duty. Thomas wasn't just another passenger. After years of service overseas and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life, Max had become more than just a companion. He was Thomas's lifeline, trained to detect and respond to the anxiety and panic attacks that often haunted him. For Thomas, flying wasn't easy, but Max made it manageable. Together, they were booked on Flight 172 to Los Angeles, where Thomas was scheduled to attend a veterans advocacy event. As boarding began, Thomas approached the gate agent with his ticket and Max's documentation. But instead of the routine acknowledgement he expected, the agent frowned and began scanning through a tablet. "I'm sorry, sir," the agent said hesitantly, "but there's an issue with bringing your dog onto this flight." Thomas blinked, confused. "Issue? He's a registered service animal. I have the papers right here." The agent glanced at the line forming behind Thomas and lowered her voice. "It's a new airline policy. Certain animals aren't allowed on board, even with documentation." Passengers nearby began to slow down, their ears catching snippets of the conversation. Thomas's voice, steady but tinged with frustration, grew firmer. "This dog isn't a pet. He's a service animal. Do you understand what that means? He's here for my medical needs." The agent shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just following protocol, sir." Max, sensing his owner's agitation, nudged Thomas's leg gently with his nose. The small gesture seemed to anchor him, but his patience was wearing thin. "That's not good enough," Thomas said. "I serve this country. I didn't ask for the struggles I came back with, but I'm doing my best to manage, and you're telling me I can't board because of some arbitrary rule?" The exchange wasn't just between Thomas and the agent anymore. Passengers began exchanging looks, some murmuring quietly among themselves. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped out of line to watch, his arms crossed. A young mother holding a toddler paused, her eyes narrowing as she listened. But it wasn't just the passengers paying attention. The tension was building, and something was about to shift. Thomas's frustration was palpable, and Max's calm demeanor only highlighted the growing unease around gate C-23. The murmurs among passengers turned louder, some clearly upset by what they were witnessing. "Are you kidding me?" an older man in a baseball cap muttered to his wife. "That man fought for this country, and now they're giving him grief over his dog." The gate agent, now visibly flustered, glanced at her supervisor, who had just arrived to assess the situation. "Sir," the supervisor began with a rehearsed calmness, "we understand your concern, but the airline has updated policies. We can't make exceptions." Thomas's voice rose, steady but commanding. "Exceptions? This isn't about exceptions. It's about rights. You don't get to decide that my service dog isn't valid because of a policy you barely understand." Max stood up, his body pressed against Thomas as if to silently reassure him. Passengers in line started stepping closer, their curiosity quickly turning into indignation. "This isn't right," said a young woman holding her boarding pass. "If it were a pet, fine, but that's a service dog." A man in his 30s pulled out his phone and began recording. "People need to see this," he said to no one in particular. "This is ridiculous." The supervisor sighed, clearly feeling the weight of the crowd's attention. "Sir," he said firmly, "we can try to rebook you on another flight where this won't be an issue." "That's not the point," Thomas snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm not just some guy with a dog. Max is the reason I can even step foot in an airport. You think rebooking solves anything? This isn't just about me. It's about how people like me are treated." The crowd around Thomas began to grow. A mother with a stroller moved closer, her brow furrowed. An elderly woman clutching her carry-on nodded in agreement, her lips pressed into a thin line. The man recording spoke up. "Hey, aren't service animals protected by law? This doesn't seem legal." The supervisor hesitated, glancing nervously at the camera. "We're simply enforcing the airline's policies," he replied, but the conviction in his voice faltered. Thomas turned to the crowd, his voice louder now. "Do you hear this? After everything I've been through, they want to deny me basic respect because of their policies. Is this what we've come to?" The terminal fell quiet, the kind of silence that comes when people are unsure of what to do next. The tension in the air was thick, the frustration almost tangible, but just as it seemed the situation might spiral further, a calm yet firm voice cut through the noise, drawing everyone's attention. The crowd turned toward the source of the voice. Standing just a few feet away was a tall, composed young man who seemed oddly familiar. His clean-cut appearance and calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the escalating chaos. It took a moment for the crowd to connect the dots, but the realization spread like wildfire. "It's Barron Trump," someone whispered, loud enough to confirm what others were thinking. Barron, carrying a small backpack and a boarding pass in hand, stepped closer to Thomas and Max. His voice was steady, but carried an authority that belied his youth. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the supervisor directly. "What's going on here?" The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "This gentleman's service dog doesn't meet the updated requirements for this flight." Barron frowned, his gaze shifting to Thomas and then to Max. "Doesn't meet the requirements? This man is a Marine veteran, and that's a service dog. What part of this situation seems okay to you?" The crowd, emboldened by Barron's presence, murmured their agreement. A woman nearby spoke up. "Exactly. He's not asking for anything unreasonable." Barron's tone remained calm, but there was an edge to his words. "I'm pretty sure federal law protects service animals, regardless of airline policies. Are you seriously willing to break the law over this?" The supervisor's confidence visibly faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued. "This isn't just about rules. It's about doing the right thing. Imagine what this man has been through, and now you're denying him dignity over a technicality." Thomas, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. "I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me like this, but thank you." Barron nodded at him before turning back to the supervisor. "I suggest you call someone higher up to resolve this because this is going to become a much bigger issue if it isn't fixed now." The man with the phone recording the incident added, "You've got people filming this from every angle. Do you really want to be the face of this story when it hits the news?" The supervisor, now visibly sweating, pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Let me speak to the manager on duty," he said, stepping away. Barron turned back to Thomas and extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, sir." Thomas shook his hand, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his frustration. "I've seen a lot of things in my life, but this is a first. You didn't have to step in, but I appreciate it." Max seemed to relax slightly, his tail wagging faintly as if sensing the change in atmosphere. But while the tide seemed to be turning, the resolution was still far from certain, and the crowd watched, holding their collective breath, to see what would happen next. As the supervisor disappeared into a nearby office to make a call, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. What had started as a quiet dispute now felt like a collective stand. Passengers gathered closer, their voices growing louder, some recording, others openly voicing their discontent. "This is bigger than airline policies," a man in his 50s said to no one in particular. "What happened to basic respect?" The young mother with a stroller chimed in. "It's disgusting. A Marine veteran and his service dog? This shouldn't even be a debate." Barron, standing tall beside Thomas, addressed the crowd. "We can't just watch and let things like this happen. It's about standing up even when it's inconvenient. If we don't, what does that say about us?" The crowd murmured in agreement. An elderly woman clutching a cane stepped forward. "Son, I've lived through a lot, and I've learned one thing. When someone's in the right, you fight for them. You don't let them fight alone." Applause rippled through the group, startling the gate agents behind the counter. One of them nervously whispered to her colleague, her gaze darting toward the growing crowd. Thomas, touched by the support, looked around, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "I don't even know what to say. For years I've felt invisible, like no one saw what people like me go through. But today, you're making me feel like I matter again." Max leaned into him, his steady presence grounding Thomas in the moment. A teenage boy stepped forward, holding a notebook. "Sir, can I shake your hand? My grandpa was a Marine too." Thomas smiled faintly and shook the boy's hand. "Your grandpa must be proud of you." The gate supervisor re-emerged, his face a mix of exhaustion and unease. He cleared his throat and approached Barron and Thomas. "We've spoken to the airline's management and they've agreed to make an exception in this case." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Thomas raised a hand to quiet them. "An exception?" he said, his tone measured but firm. "This isn't about exceptions. It's about doing what's right, for me and for every veteran or person with a disability who comes after me. Max and I deserve more than a one-time pass." Barron nodded in agreement. "He's right. This isn't over. Policies like these need to be reviewed. People shouldn't have to fight for what's already protected by law." The supervisor, clearly uncomfortable, muttered, "We'll take that feedback to the appropriate team." But the crowd's energy had already shifted. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about something bigger, something everyone felt compelled to fight for. The cheers slowly quieted as the supervisor stepped back, his attempt at control slipping through his fingers. Thomas adjusted his stance, taking a deep breath. He didn't want a fleeting victory. He wanted meaningful change. Barron seemed to sense this, stepping closer to Thomas and speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't just about one flight or one veteran," Barron said, addressing the gate agents and the crowd. "It's about respecting the people who've given so much for this country. Policies like these aren't just inconvenient. They're harmful." The gate supervisor hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "You're right," he said, though the words sounded more like a concession than a conviction. "We'll make sure this incident is reviewed at the corporate level." Thomas looked at Barron, his gratitude plain in his expression. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have just stayed in line and watched." Barron shook his head. "If we stand by and do nothing, we're part of the problem. My father always told me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." The supervisor gestured toward the boarding area. "Mr. Thomas, Max is cleared to board. We'll make sure you're seated comfortably." Thomas nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though his voice remained steady. "Thank you. But I hope you'll think about what this means for the next person in my shoes." As Thomas and Max made their way toward the gate, the crowd broke into applause, not just for them, but for the principle they represented. People smiled, clapped, and called out words of encouragement. Barron lingered for a moment, watching as the pair boarded the plane. A woman in her 30s approached him. "That was incredible," she said. "Most people wouldn't have said a word." Barron smiled faintly. "Most people care. They just need someone to remind them they can make a difference." Thomas turned back from the jetway, meeting Barron's eyes. He raised a hand in a gesture of thanks, his face a mixture of relief and determination. Max, as if sensing the significance of the moment, wagged his tail just once before following Thomas onto the plane. But as the plane door closed, the real impact of what had happened lingered with those left behind, a collective reminder of the power of standing up for one another. The terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy left behind felt different. People exchanged knowing glances and quiet words about what they had just witnessed. Strangers who would have otherwise passed each other by now felt a shared connection, one forged in a moment of standing up for what was right. On board Flight 172, Thomas sat by the window, Max resting faithfully at his feet. He stared out at the tarmac, the adrenaline of the encounter finally subsiding. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not just as a veteran, but as a person whose struggles and dignity mattered. Meanwhile, Barron Trump took his seat a few rows back. He didn't seek attention or validation for what he had done. His satisfaction came from knowing he had acted when it mattered. A flight attendant approached him quietly, saying, "Thank you for what you did back there. You made a difference." Barron simply nodded. We all did. As the plane took off, the crowd at gate C-23 dispersed, but many still carried the story with them. Social media posts were already circulating, with hashtags like #RespectOurVeterans and #ServiceDogs. Our heroes trending within hours. Videos of the incident were gaining traction, with thousands of comments praising the courage of those who stood up, especially the young man who led the charge. This moment wasn't just a fleeting event. It was a reminder of how small actions could ripple outward, inspiring others to do the same. The moral was clear. When confronted with injustice, silence is never the answer. Compassion and courage are contagious, and when one person stands up, it empowers others to follow. As the video closes, the narrator's voice delivers the final thought. We all have a choice. Whether it's a crowded airport terminal or the quiet moments of everyday life, we can choose to act, to speak, and to stand for what's right. Let today's story remind us that when we stand together, change is possible. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of standing up for others. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of what truly matters.